Hello friends, my name is Tom Thibodeau, and with my good friend Emilio Alvarez, we are creating a Viterbo University Servant Leadership YouTube channel. In this way, we hope to inspire and inform, to encourage and engage you in the good work of serving and leading. Our topic today is transitions. Transitions. Bruce Feiler, 2 years ago, wrote an amazing book called Navigating Transitions. Rick Kite from our D.B. Reinhardt Institute for Leadership and Ethics brought Bruce to campus via Zoom. And he talked to us about his new book, What Happens When We Go Through Transitions. This was just before the pandemic, and since that great disruption, all of us have found ourselves going through transitions. Bruce had cancer. It looked to be very serious, and he was 42 years of age with twin daughters who were 6. He knew he could die, so he asked a group of friends of his if they would be the surrogate fathers should he die. And they met together and they called it a Council of Dads, and Bruce wrote about it, and it's soon to be an NBC television program, a Council of Dads. He recovers from the cancer and then was invited back to his alma mater 20 years after he graduated. They asked him if he'd be the MC for a panel of successful graduates. And all these people came in with word-perfect resumes, and they handed them to him. And people sat down, and he took that pack of resumes and he ripped them in half. He said, "These are all your successes. Tell your moms, they'll be quite proud." What the rest of us want to hear about is, what have you struggled with these last 20 years? And thus began this marvelous conversation of how each person had struggled. That night, there was a banquet, and at one end was the bar, and at the other end was the food. He got himself a drink, and then took him 2 hours to get from the bar to the food buffet, because everyone stopped him along the line and wanted to tell them about the challenges that they had in their lives. Shortly after that, Bruce gets a call from his mother. His father, who had retired at age 74, now was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and his dad had attempted suicide. The family was beside themselves. What should they do? How do they handle this? Nothing seemed to be working. And then Bruce calls his dad and said, "Dad, I'm going to call you on Monday at the end of the weekend, and I want you to tell me what it was like growing up in your house." His dad said, "Okay, can you promise me that, Dad?" He said, "I will." Bruce calls his dad on Monday morning, and his dad had written about 10 pages of notes, and they began to talk for over an hour. He said, "Okay, Dad, next week I want to call you and ask you about your brothers and sisters individually." He called the next week, and Dad had another 15 to 20 pages that he had written about his growing up in his family of origin. After a year of calling and talking to his dad on his phone, Bruce realized that everyone has a story. And he dug into it and began a story project in which he interviewed over 250 people across the country. And what did he find out in his interviews? That all of us have challenges. In fact, in our adult lives between ages 20 and 70, in those 50 years, all of us will go through an average of 4 or 5 transitions, and those transitions take 4 to 5 years. Well, think about it for just a moment. The transition of going off to college from 18 to 22 to 23, you begin your new job. You begin a new job, the transition it takes. How about marriage, the first 4 or 5 years? It's a transition. What happens later in life or mid-career if you choose to change jobs or move in a new direction? It takes a while to get resettled. Think about how hard retirement is. You've worked for 40, 45 years, and now what? After work is not there, have you developed enough hobbies and leisures and relationships to sustain you? Think about the transition of moving from independent living to dependent living. All of us go through transitions. Transition is the understanding of liminality, uncertainty. You know where you are, but you don't know what's next. During the last 2 years of disruptions for all kinds of reasons in the world, we are uncertain what's to come next. And he began to look at this uncertainty and how is it that people navigate transitions? What do you do in times of liminality? Well, here's what he found out. Each of us have transitions. It's normal. They're both personal, that I experience individually, and collective. that we experience together as human beings. He understands that all transitions can be voluntary. I choose to go off and live and work in another country. I choose a new opportunity that exists elsewhere. I choose a relationship that I hadn't thought about previously. Our lives change. But we also have involuntary transitions. You all have had experiences where people will tell you, you know, cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. It really shook me into a new way of understanding. I had no way of knowing had I not suffered. Well, if we look back at the last 2.5 years in the world, we've gone through a collective, involuntary transition. Nobody hoped for a virus, nobody predicted a pandemic, and yet here we are. And how is it that people personally and collectively have found ways to navigate through? 3 ways that I think are important for us as leaders in serving the needs of others. 1, storytelling. How many times in the last 2 years have you found yourselves telling stories about your parents and your grandparents? We've gone back now and told stories about World War II and the Great Depression, about our parents and our grandparents. People have gone back further and looking to their immigrant stories of how people came from long distances with very little to sustain them and they got through. Have we not all drawn on the strength of our ancestors by telling stories? What we find out in the research is this: children who know their family's life stories well have a stronger sense of resilience. You know who and whose you are. A second way in which we navigate transitions is rituals, our celebrations, the ways in which we gather. Many of us have had much difficulty in the last 2 or 3 years not being able to celebrate Christmas in 2020, gather for Thanksgiving. Birthday parties were postponed. What was tragic is the number of people who said, my loved one has died, my life partner has died, I've lost my spouse. A celebration of life will be held at a later date, and then was never held. Going through that transition without the rituals, think about how important 4th of July parades have been. The fireworks, think of how important it has been to kind of come back together. Professional sports, celebrating the transitions by celebrating the World Series and the Super Bowl and playoffs and championships. Think of the number of students who miss prom or homecoming or our first date because they were locked down and locked in. We need rituals which guide us through the difficult times in our life and to celebrate the lives we have. And finally, we get through transitions through creativity. It takes courage to create. It takes courage to find new ways in which to renew and restore ourselves. What we have found is that people have rediscovered their kitchen table, have rediscovered the ethnic foods, whether it be Spanish or Irish or Thai. They've gone back into their family cookbooks, and the foods that were so familiar are now feeding themselves because in creative ways we are reconnecting. At the beginning of the pandemic here in Wisconsin, you could not find a cribbage board. People had rediscovered board games and ways to play with each other. Charades has now become popular because instead of going to the theaters, we've decided we can entertain one another. The number of people who have taken up musical instruments, stained glass, the number of people who have begun to write poetry and novels and wanting to share their words and their works of creativity with one another. Uncertainty also is opportunity to learn stories that we've never told, to practice rituals that are sacred and significant, and to find new ways of entertaining and engaging with one another. Good work, hard work, noble work. Thank you, friends. Until next time, peace and all good.